The first time Harriet Harper walked into the town of Dry Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1878, she did so with a busted wagon wheel, a suitcase held shut by a leather strap, and the particular kind of quiet dignity that only comes from having already survived too much to be afraid of anything new. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair that had been pinned up since dawn, and was now losing its battle against the desert wind, and eyes the color of the sky just before a storm breaks, that deep and indeterminate shade between gray and blue that made people look twice without knowing why. She was not the kind of woman who stopped conversations when she walked into a room, but she was the kind of woman that, once noticed, made a person wonder how they had missed her in the first place. The wagon belonged to a man named Cecil Prout, who had offered her a ride from the rail station at Santa Fe in exchange for what he had described as companionship, but which Harriet had correctly interpreted to mean something she had no interest in providing. When the wheel cracked on a rock somewhere in the canyon stretch east of Dry Creek, she had taken her suitcase and walked the rest of the 4 miles without a word, leaving Cecil Prout to sort out his own problems, which she had found to be a deeply satisfying decision. Dry Creek itself was the sort of settlement that could not quite decide whether it wanted to become a proper town or remain a wide spot on a dirt road. It had a general store, a saloon called the Copper Spur, a small adobe church that was also used as a schoolhouse, a livery stable, a blacksmith shop, a telegraph office that doubled as the post, and a cluster of homes that ranged from solid timber-framed houses belonging to the more established families to low adobe structures that had been thrown up in a hurry when the silver mines nearby started pulling enough ore to make men believe the place would last. Harriet had come to Dry Creek because she had answered an advertisement in the Santa Fe Daily New Mexican, which had read, "Wanted reliable woman of good character, skilled in cooking and household management, to serve as housekeeper for respected rancher. Wages paid regular. Inquire at the Dry Creek General Store for the name Bernard Whitfield." She had read that advertisement 4 times before writing her letter, and she had made a point of using the word housekeeper in her reply 3 separate times, just so there would be no misunderstanding about what she was applying for and what she was not. The general store was run by a round-faced woman named Agnes Beaumont, who had been in Dry Creek since before there was much of a creek to speak of, dry or otherwise. Agnes looked Harriet up and down with the frank assessment of a woman who had seen enough newcomers arrive with grand dreams and leave 6 months later with nothing but dust in their pockets, and apparently decided that Harriet had more sense than most. "Bernard Whitfield," Agnes said, handing Harriet a tin cup of water without being asked, which Harriet accepted with genuine gratitude. "Good man. Runs the Double H Ranch about 3 miles north of town on the red clay road. Lost his wife 2 winters back. Influenza took her. He's got a son 8 years old name of Tommy. The boy needs someone stable around him more than the ranch needs a housekeeper if you want the truth of it." "Thank you for being honest," Harriet said. "I always am," Agnes replied. "You got somewhere to sleep tonight, because it's too late to head out to the Double H, and I won't send a woman alone on that road after dark." Harriet did not have anywhere to sleep. She had $4.30, the clothes in her suitcase, a copy of David Copperfield with a broken spine, and the kind of practical relationship with adversity that comes from having spent most of her life being the person that everyone else leaned on without anyone thinking to lean back. Agnes gave her a room above the store for 50 cents and told her Bernard Whitfield came into town on Friday mornings, which was tomorrow, and that she could meet him then or ride out in the morning light if she was impatient. Harriet was not impatient. She was careful. There was a difference. She sat in that small room above the store with the window open to the cooling desert night and the sound of someone playing a harmonica somewhere down the street. And she thought about all the places she had been before this one, and all the people who had passed through her life without ever quite deciding that she was worth staying for. She had grown up in Missouri, the second of 4 children, and she had learned early that second meant you got the hand-me-downs and the half-attention and the vague sense that everyone was always slightly more interested in whoever was standing next to you. Her older sister Marguerite had been the beauty of the family, dramatic and quick-laughing, and her younger brothers had been boys, which in 1860s Missouri meant they commanded a certain automatic importance. Harriet had been the capable one, the reliable one, the one who managed the kitchen and kept the accounts and made sure the younger ones had clean clothes. She had been useful her whole life. But useful and chosen were 2 entirely different things, and she had known the difference since she was 9 years old and watched her mother unconsciously set a place at the table for everyone except her. Not from cruelty, but from the simple terrible fact that Harriet would handle it herself without being asked. She had been engaged once to a schoolteacher named Robert Calloway, who had seemed genuinely fond of her for about a year before deciding to marry the daughter of the town's most prosperous merchant, because the merchant's daughter came with a house and a business connection, and Robert had always been someone who thought one step ahead toward the most advantageous arrangement. He had told Harriet, with the particular spineless kindness of a man who knows he is doing something wrong, that she was wonderful and he hoped they could remain friends. And Harriet had looked at him for a long moment and then said, very quietly, that she wished him well, and she had meant it, because even then she had understood that a man who would leave her for advantage was not a man she wanted to stay. She had come west after her parents died, her father first in 1875 and her mother 6 months after, and her siblings had divided up the house and the modest furniture, and had thanked Harriet for all her years of managing things and had then, quite thoroughly, gotten on with their lives. She had taken her share, which was smaller than she might have argued for but which she had not argued for because she was tired, and she had gone west, because west was where people went when they needed to become something different than what they had been. She had spent a year in Santa Fe, working in a boarding house, doing laundry and cooking, being useful, being reliable, being invisible in the exact way that capable women tend to be invisible, always present and never quite seen. And then she had read the advertisement for Bernard Whitfield's housekeeper position, and something about the plainness of it, the honest simplicity of a man asking for exactly what he needed without any embellishment or pretense, had made her write the letter. She fell asleep to the harmonica and the desert wind, and woke up to sunlight and the smell of Agnes's coffee, which was strong enough to startle a man back to consciousness. Bernard Whitfield arrived in Dry Creek at 8:30 on Friday morning, which Agnes had already told Harriet was exactly when he always arrived, because Bernard Whitfield was, apparently, a man who kept to a schedule with the same thoroughness he kept to everything else. Harriet was sitting at the counter in the general store drinking her second cup of Agnes's aggressive coffee when the door opened, and a man came in who was, she thought, exactly what the advertisement had suggested, and nothing it had not. He was 30 years old, though he looked a year or 2 older from the sun and the work, with broad shoulders and the kind of unhurried way of moving that suggested he had learned to conserve energy, because there was always more to do after whatever he was currently doing. He had dark brown hair that wanted cutting, a jaw that needed shaving, and brown eyes that were steady and serious in a way that was not unfriendly, but was clearly not careless either. He wore a dark canvas work coat that had been mended at the left elbow, and his boots were worn but well maintained, which Harriet had learned was a reliable indicator of a man's character, not whether he had money, but whether he bothered to take care of what he had. Agnes said, "Bernard, this here is Harriet Harper. She answered your advertisement." Bernard Whitfield looked at Harriet with those steady brown eyes and said, "Miss Harper, you walked from the Canyon Road last evening." It was not a question. Harriet blinked. "How did you know that?" "Jim Pruitt's brother came through last night complaining about his wheel and mentioning the woman who had abandoned him on the road." "I'd say you made the right call." "I generally do," Harriet said, and then wondered if that had sounded arrogant. But the corner of Bernard's mouth moved, not quite a smile but the suggestion of one, and he said, "Good," as if that settled the matter, and then he sat down on the stool next to her and talked to her for an hour and a quarter about the ranch and what the work entailed and what he was paying, which was $8 a month with room and board. And during the entire conversation he was direct and honest and treated her opinions about the work as worth hearing, which was, Harriet thought, a refreshingly uncommon experience. She took the job. He helped her tie her suitcase to his wagon, and they rode north on the red clay road in the early morning light, with the desert spreading out around them in every shade of red and gold and pale green, and neither of them felt the particular pressure to fill the silence that people feel when they are nervous around each other. They were simply two people going to the same place for honest reasons, and the quiet between them was, surprisingly, comfortable. The Double H Ranch was not grand, but it was solid. There was a main house built from adobe and timber with a wide front porch and 4 rooms, a separate bunkhouse where 2 ranch hands, a man named Cass Dillard and a younger man named Pico Reyes, lived when they were not out on the range, a stable, a chicken coop, a kitchen garden that had been neglected for most of a year and was crying out for someone to attend to it, and about 400 acres of grazing land, with a small herd of cattle that Bernard was working to build into something that could sustain the ranch properly. Tommy was sitting on the porch steps when they arrived. He was a small 8-year-old boy with his father's brown eyes and a serious face that broke into a cautious curiosity when he looked at Harriet. He did not run to her or say anything dramatic. He simply looked at her with the careful assessment of a child who has learned not to expect people to stay and said, "Can you make corn bread?" "I can make corn bread," Harriet said. "My mother made it on Sundays," he said. "Then we will make it on Sundays," she said. Tommy nodded once, with the gravity of a small person conducting important business, and that was how Harriet Harper came to live at the Double H Ranch. The first weeks were about learning the rhythms of the place. She rose before dawn to start the kitchen fire and have coffee ready before Bernard came in from checking the livestock. She cooked 3 meals a day, cleaned the house, mended clothes, tended the kitchen garden, and in the late afternoons when the heat was settling into the long golden hour before evening, she sometimes sat with Tommy at the kitchen table and helped him with his reading, which he did with his tongue pressed firmly to the corner of his mouth, and an expression of fierce concentration that made Harriet want to smile every single time. Bernard Whitfield, she was learning, was a man of genuine goodness. Not the showy kind of goodness that announces itself, but the quiet kind that shows up in the way he never raised his voice with his animals, in the way he paid Cass and Pico on time and treated them with basic human respect, in the way he made sure Tommy had a proper bedtime story even on the nights when he came in late from the range with his shoulders dropping from exhaustion. He was also lonely in a way that he would not have named it and probably did not think about directly. His wife Ellen had been dead for 2 years, and he had, Harriet suspected, simply packed that grief into a compartment and continued functioning, because there was a ranch to run and a boy to raise, and the world did not stop for grief, and men like Bernard Whitfield tended to run on obligation and stubbornness when everything else had run out. He was not cold. He was courteous and straightforward, and occasionally, when something pleased him, genuinely warm in a way that came suddenly like sunlight through a cloud gap. But he kept to himself in the evenings, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and whatever thinking he did in the quiet, and Harriet respected that and gave him his space, because she understood the value of space and the importance of not requiring people to explain their silences. But she was aware of him. She would be foolish to pretend otherwise, even just to herself. She was aware of him in the way you become aware of the architecture of a place you have decided might be home, the way you start to notice which floorboards creak, and where the light falls best in the morning, and which door sticks when the weather changes. She noticed that he always said good morning to her directly and with attention, not distracted, not as a formality, but with actual present acknowledgement, as though her being there in the morning was something he was, on some level, glad of. She noticed that he sometimes paused in the kitchen doorway in the evenings under the pretense of checking the coffee pot, and stayed a moment longer than checking a coffee pot required. She noticed that when she was in the garden and he passed by on his way to the stable, he slowed down. She noticed all of these things, and she put them away in a drawer in the back of her mind and did not look at them, because she had been wrong about men's interest before. And she had also learned, at considerable personal cost, that noticing someone's interest and acting on it were two entirely different decisions requiring two entirely different kinds of courage, and she was not at all sure she had the second kind. It was Cass Dillard who first introduced a complication, not with any malicious intent, but with the casual thoughtlessness of a man who did not always think before he spoke. He was a lean, weathered man of about 40 with a dark mustache and the easy confidence of someone who had spent 20 years being good at one thing and assumed that made him good at most things. He had been working for Bernard for 3 years and seemed to consider himself something of an authority on the ranch's social landscape. One evening in the 4th week of Harriet's time at the Double H, Cass came into the kitchen while she was cleaning up after supper and leaned against the doorframe with his thumbs in his belt loops and said, "You know, the rancher's wife over at the Garrison place, she and Bernard used to be close before he married Ellen. Some folk in town think now that Ellen's been gone a while, that might resurface." Harriet did not look up from the pot she was scrubbing. "That is not my business," she said. "Just thought you'd want to know the lay of the land," Cass said, with the particular self-satisfaction of someone who has just deposited an unsettling piece of information and is now observing the results. "I appreciate the thought," Harriet said, in a tone that made it clear she did not, and Cass, who was shrewd enough in his way, took himself back out to the bunkhouse. But the information lodged itself somewhere in Harriet's mind, not because she believed it should change anything, but because it confirmed what she had already learned about her own situation, which was that she was, once again, the reliable woman in the background, the capable one, the useful one, while someone more obvious and more connected occupied whatever larger space might exist in a man's heart. She had spent her entire life being the second choice, the fallback, the person who was wonderful but not quite wonderful enough to be first, and she told herself firmly, completely at peace with that, because she had not come to the Double H for romance. She had come for work, and the work was honest and the pay was fair, and she was going to be fine. She was very good at telling herself she was going to be fine. The Garrison Ranch was about 8 miles east of the Double H, and the woman Cass had mentioned was named Vera Garrison, widowed about a year ago when her husband had died in a riding accident. And she was a handsome woman of 32 with blonde hair and an expressive quality that made every room she entered feel immediately informed of her presence. Harriet met her for the first time at the Sunday service at the Adobe Church, 3 weeks after arriving in Dry Creek, on a warm June morning, with the smell of sage coming through the open windows. Vera Garrison arrived late and sat 2 rows ahead of Harriet, and throughout the service turned around twice to smile at Bernard. And Bernard, sitting beside Tommy with his hat in his hands, nodded both times with what Harriet could not entirely read. Afterward, in the yard in front of the church, Vera made her way directly to Bernard with the smooth social efficiency of a woman who knows what she wants and sees no reason to be indirect about it. And Harriet took Tommy's hand and walked with him to where Agnes Beaumont was standing with a group of women near the gate. And she talked to Agnes about the garden and the coming summer heat, and did not look over her shoulder once, because she was not the kind of person who looked over her shoulder. Or she tried not to be. That evening Bernard came home quiet and stayed quiet through supper and into the evening on the porch, and Harriet put Tommy to bed and then sat in the kitchen with her book and the lamp, and let herself feel, briefly and privately, the familiar weight of the thing she always felt in these situations, which was not quite grief and not quite resignation but something in between. The particular sorrow of a woman who has accepted that the universe seems to have decided she is not the kind of person that men choose first. She shook it off, because she was practical, and went to sleep. The summer advanced with the remorseless heat of the New Mexico high desert, and Harriet settled into the Double H with the thoroughness of a woman who does everything properly or not at all. The kitchen garden went from a weedy embarrassment to a productive operation that was providing beans, squash, tomatoes, and herbs by July. The house acquired the quality of genuine homeliness. Tommy's reading improved dramatically. The Sunday corn bread became a ritual. She and Bernard developed a kind of conversational friendship that she had not entirely anticipated, and that she found, if she was honest, to be one of the more sustaining pleasures of her daily life. He talked to her in the evening sometimes, not always, but with increasing frequency, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee while she finished the last tasks of the day, and they talked about the ranch, about books, about the territory, about Tommy, about the larger world, about ideas. He had read more than she had expected and thought carefully about what he read, and he asked her opinion on things and listened to her answers with the kind of full attention that was becoming. She was gradually realizing her favorite thing about him. He did not talk about Ellen often, but once in late July, on an evening when the heat had broken early and there was a rare coolness coming off the mountains, he mentioned her, and Harriet put down her mending and listened with her whole self, because she understood that grief needs witnesses, and that witnessing it was something real she could give. She was a good woman, Bernard said, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Better than I was ready to appreciate early on. You don't always know what you have until the keeping of it becomes the whole question. No, Harriet said, you don't. He looked at her then, steady and direct, and said, you lost people. My parents, my engagement. That's different, he said. Yes and no, she said. Loss is loss. The shape of it changes, but the weight is similar. He was quiet for a moment. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone more temporary, he said. Most people passing through here are temporary. I am not passing through, she said. He looked at her for another moment with those steady brown eyes, and then he said, good, in exactly the same tone he had used on the first morning, and something in Harriet's chest moved very quietly and she looked down at her mending. August brought trouble in the form of Dale Morrow, who rode into the territory from Texas with 2 other men, and whose reputation, which reached Dry Creek before he did via the telegraph, included cattle theft and a confrontation in Amarillo that had left one man with a broken arm. He was not, strictly speaking, Harriet's problem, but he took to riding past the Double H with enough frequency to make her uneasy, and once he came to the door while Bernard was out on the range and asked for water with a look that suggested water was not the only thing he was appraising. Harriet gave him water and looked him in the eye the entire time, and did not invite him in and did not step back from the doorway, and he left. But she told Bernard that evening, and Bernard's expression went very still in the way she had come to recognize as his version of anger, controlled and cold and serious. He comes back while I'm not here. You stay inside and fire 1 shot from the rifle toward the sky. Cass and Pico are always within earshot, he said. I know how to handle myself, she said. I don't doubt it, he said. I still don't want you handling him alone. It was, she thought, a distinction worth noticing. He was not dismissing her capability. He was objecting to an unfair situation, not a personal inadequacy. She filed that away with the other things she was not looking at directly. Dale Morrow came back once more, in early September, and this time Bernard was at the ranch and met him at the gate with a calmness that was more effective than any raised voice could have been, and Morrow and his companions left and did not return. Bernard and the sheriff in Dry Creek, a reliable man named Owen Tate, had apparently reached an understanding with Morrow that the territory was not going to be a comfortable place for him to remain, and by mid-September he and his men had moved on south toward the Texas border. Harriet was genuinely grateful for the resolution and told Bernard so, and he said, with a quiet certainty, "No one is going to bother you here," and she believed him. It was Vera Garrison who changed the shape of things in a way that Harriet had not predicted, and which made everything both clearer and more complicated at the same time. In late September, Vera came to the Double H on a Tuesday afternoon with a pie and a smile, and the specific social energy of a woman making an intentional move. And she and Bernard sat on the porch and talked for 2 hours while Harriet was in the house doing the ironing, and trying very sincerely to be completely unaffected by the sound of Vera's laugh floating in through the window. Tommy came inside halfway through the visit and sat at the kitchen table, and looked at Harriet with the frank assessment that children bring to emotional situations when they have seen enough adult behavior to understand that something is happening but not quite enough to know what it means. "Miss Harper," he said. "Yes, Tommy. Do you like my father?" Harriet set down the iron very carefully. "I respect your father very much," she said. Tommy considered this with his tongue at the corner of his mouth. "That is not what I asked," he said. Harriet looked at this 8-year-old boy and thought that some people arrive in the world already possessing a clarity that most adults spend their lives trying to achieve. "Your father and I work well together," she said, which was true, and also, she recognized even as she said it, a sideways answer. Tommy nodded slowly, in the way of someone who has heard what was underneath the words and is choosing not to push it further just yet. Then he went outside to play, and Harriet stood in the kitchen with the iron in her hand and admitted to herself, quietly and without drama, that she had feelings for Bernard Whitfield that were well outside the professional category she had originally assigned to him, and that this was inconvenient, and that she was going to continue doing her job excellently regardless. Vera Garrison's visits became a pattern through October. She was not unkind to Harriet. She was the kind of carefully pleasant that women sometimes use toward other women when they are aware there might be competition. Even competition they do not take seriously. She thanked Harriet for the coffee and said the house looked wonderful, and told Bernard, in Harriet's hearing, that he was lucky to have found such a capable housekeeper. Harriet smiled and said nothing and went back to the kitchen. On a cool Thursday in mid-October, Bernard came in from the range earlier than usual and found Harriet in the kitchen making supper with her hair slightly loose from its pins and her sleeves rolled up in flour on her hands from the biscuits she was making. And he stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. And when she looked up and met his eyes, neither of them moved for a breath that felt, to Harriet, slightly longer than a regular breath. Then she said, "You're home early," and he said, "Horse through a shoe," and she turned back to the biscuits, and that was that. But it was not that. She knew it was not that, and she suspected he knew it too, and the question was what either of them was going to do about a feeling that lived in the kitchen doorway and the evening conversations, and the way he said good morning, except that Harriet had a very clear position on feelings that had not been invited into existence by anything explicit, which was that you did not assume, and you did not act. And you most certainly did not make yourself vulnerable to the particular humiliation of having reached for something that turned out to belong to someone else. She had done that with Robert Calloway. She would not do it again. November arrived with cold nights and the smell of wood smoke, and with it came something that shifted the delicate equilibrium of the Double H in a direction Harriet had not anticipated. Bernard got a letter from his sister in Kansas, who was also dealing with a sick husband and 3 children under 6, and could not come for the winter as she had been planning. The same week, Cass Dillard announced that he was leaving to go back to Texas to be near his aging mother, and the combination of circumstances left the Double H with a practical reorganization of its workforce, and it also left Harriet and Bernard and Tommy somewhat more alone together as a unit than they had been, which was not uncomfortable, but which had a quality to it that Harriet could not entirely pretend not to notice. Pico Reyes stayed on. He was a quiet young man of 22, originally from a town south of Albuquerque, and he was steady and good with the cattle and asked for nothing more than fair pay and to be treated decently, which Bernard provided without any fanfare. On the first truly cold night of November, when the temperature dropped below freezing and the stars were very sharp and brilliant overhead, and the fire in the main room was the social center of the house, Bernard was sitting by the fire reading and Tommy was asleep and Harriet was at the table with her mending when Bernard said, without looking up from his book, "What made you come west?" She looked at him for a moment. "I answered your advertisement. Before that." She set down the mending. "My parents died and my siblings settled, and the life I had been maintaining was somebody else's life more than it was mine." He looked up from the book then. "What does that mean?" "It means I was very capable and very useful for a very long time," she said. "And one day I looked up and realized that all the things I had been doing with such diligence and care were things that other people benefited from more directly than I did. And I decided it was time to go somewhere and be useful for myself for a while." "And is this it?" he said. "Being useful for yourself?" "It is closer than it was," she said, which was honest. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that steady attention. "You're careful," he said, "careful in a particular way, like you've decided something." "I've decided several things," she said. "I've found it's generally better to decide things than to drift and hope." "What have you decided about here?" he asked. She looked at him directly. "That this is a good place and that I intend to stay as long as I am wanted and useful." "Wanted and useful," he repeated, with something in his voice that she could not quite name, a quality of carefully restrained thought. She picked up her mending and he went back to his book. And outside the wind came across the desert and the fire shifted and the house was warm. And Harriet sat with her needle and thread and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was dangerously close to contentment. It was Agnes Beaumont, of all people, who brought things to a head entirely without meaning to, on the first Friday in December when Harriet came into town for supplies. Agnes was the kind of woman who spoke plainly and trusted other people to be adult enough to handle it, which was, in Harriet's estimation, both her most valuable quality and her most occasionally alarming one. "Vera Garrison has been telling people she expects Bernard to offer before spring," Agnes said, handing Harriet a bag of flour across the counter without breaking conversational stride. Harriet said nothing. "I thought you ought to know," Agnes said. "Not because it's your business necessarily. Because I have eyes and I think it matters more to you than you're letting on." "Agnes," Harriet said. I know," Agnes said. "None of my affair. But I've seen the way he looks at you when you're not watching him, and I've seen the way you look at him when you think nobody's paying attention. And I have been watching people try and fail to communicate with each other for 30 years in this store, and I am not above pointing out when two people are being particularly obtuse about it." Harriet stared at her. "He looks at me." Agnes gave her a patient, slightly exasperated look. "Child, that man watches you cross the yard like he is trying to memorize it." Harriet paid for her supplies and drove back to the ranch in the wagon with the cold December wind in her face and her thoughts in a state of organized chaos that she was attempting to manage with her usual practicality and largely failing at. He watched her cross the yard. She turned that over. She thought about all the good mornings and the kitchen doorway pauses, and the evenings by the fire and the way he said good when she said she was not passing through. And she thought about the fact that she was 26 years old and had spent most of her conscious life being the reliable background presence in other people's more interesting stories. And she was tired, genuinely tired, of being careful to the point of paralysis. But she was also afraid. She was afraid of being wrong about this, because being wrong about this would cost her the job and the room and the kitchen garden and the Sunday corn bread and Tommy's reading and the evening conversations. And those things had, somewhere in the last 7 months, stop being merely a living situation and become something that felt alarmingly like a life. She decided that she would not do anything. She would continue as she was. She would be professional and capable and reliable. She would not make assumptions. She had made this decision and arrived back at the Double H and unhitched the wagon and carried the supplies into the kitchen and was putting them away when Bernard came in, and she could tell from the particular quality of his stillness that something had happened. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Vera Garrison came by this afternoon," he said. "Harriet kept her hands busy with the flour." "I see. She had some expectations about our friendship," he said. "I had to be honest with her that I did not share those expectations." Harriet's hands stilled. She did not turn around. "She was not particularly pleased," he said. "I imagine not," Harriet said carefully. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him behind her in the kitchen the way you feel a fire's warmth, not from specific sensation but from a general awareness of presence. "Harriet," he said. She turned around. He was standing near the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, which was, she had learned, what he did when he was not sure how to start a thing he had decided he was going to say. And he looked at her with those steady brown eyes that she had spent 7 months trying not to look into for too long, and he said, "There is something I've been wanting to say for some time, and I keep not saying it for reasons that I think are less good than they seemed." "What reasons?" she asked, and she heard her own voice come out quieter than she intended. "That you came here to work and I don't want to make your situation here complicated," he said. "That you are a private person and I don't want to presume. That I'm probably not very easy and the ranch is a lot of hard work, and Tommy is still grieving his mother underneath all that quiet he shows the world, and any woman who takes us on is taking on more than most would think is fair." She looked at him for a long moment. "Those are reasonable reasons," she said. "I know they are," he said, "but they're not big enough." She felt something in her chest open like a door she had been holding shut. "I have thought about you every single day since you walked into Agnes's store with a busted wagon wheel and $4 and a suitcase held together with a strap," he said, with the steadiness of a man who has made up his mind and means to follow through. "And I have watched you make this house into something it hasn't been in 2 years, and I have had better conversations with you than I have had with anyone in longer than that. And I am standing here telling you that I would very much like to continue having those conversations for the rest of my life, if you have any interest at all in that." Harriet Harper, who had told herself for 26 years that she was fine, that she was capable, that she did not need to be chosen first, that she was practical enough not to grieve the things she had never been given, felt her throat tighten in a way that was equal parts joy and the particular ache of someone who has been waiting for something without admitting they were waiting. "Bernard," she said, and her voice was steady but not quite the way it usually was, "I have been nobody's first choice for my entire life. I need you to understand what that means before you say anything else. I have been the reliable one, the useful one, the one that people are grateful for in the way you are grateful for a good pair of boots, dependable and necessary, and never quite what you wanted most. My fiancé left me for someone with a better dowry. My family thanked me for 30 years of managing their lives, and then reorganized themselves without noticing the gap I left. I have been second and late and convenient and practical my whole life, and I am not complaining about it because it made me strong. But I need to be honest with you that, if you are about to tell me that I am the next practical choice, I would rather you didn't, because I think I deserve to hold out for something better than that." Bernard listened to every word of this with the same focused attention he gave everything that mattered to him, and when she finished, he set his hat down on the kitchen table with the deliberateness of a man who is not in a hurry, and he said, "I hear you, and I want to tell you something true." She waited. "I'm not choosing you because Vera Garrison was inconvenient, or because you run this house well, or because Tommy likes you, though all of those things are real," he said. "I am choosing you because you are the most fully present person I have encountered in a very long time, and because you have never been anything other than completely honest with me, And because when you come into a room, I am aware of it in a way that I cannot explain practically and have stopped trying to. I am choosing you first, Harriet. Not after anyone else, not as the sensible choice, first. He stopped and looked at her, and his eyes were very direct and very serious, and completely without the hesitation or qualification that had preceded every important statement anyone had ever made to her before. I am choosing first, he said, and I mean every word of it. Harriet Harper stood in the kitchen of the Double H Ranch on a cold December evening in 1878, in New Mexico Territory, with the fire going in the next room and the wind coming off the mountains outside and a small boy asleep down the hall, and she thought about all the years of being quietly necessary, and she looked at this steady, good, serious man with his hat on the table and his honest eyes, and she made a decision of her own. I believe you, she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, not hurried but purposeful, and he took her hands in both of his, and he held them with a gentleness and a certainty that went straight through every careful wall she had built, and he said, "Good. Because I intend to spend considerable time making absolutely sure you keep believing it." She laughed, which surprised them both, a real laugh, not a polite one, and he smiled in the full and complete version of it that she had seen only a handful of times and had privately thought was the best thing about his face. And they stood there in the kitchen with their hands joined while the fire crackled in the next room, and it was, she thought, exactly right. He kissed her that evening for the first time, standing on the front porch after the fire had burned down, and the night had gone fully dark and cold and brilliant with stars. And it was the kind of kiss that is not asking a question but answering one, and she kissed him back with the same certainty, and the desert was very quiet around them and very large, and she felt, for the first time in her memory, as though she were exactly the right size for the space she occupied. December moved forward with the dual quality of all genuinely happy times, the days feeling both rich and quickly gone. Bernard and Harriet existed in a new register of their already established rhythm, the same work and the same conversations and the same household, but with an openness between them that had not been there before, an ease of acknowledged feeling that made everything simpler without making anything less real. Tommy noticed immediately, of course, because Tommy always noticed things. He appeared in the kitchen 2 days after the conversation in the kitchen and fixed Harriet with a very serious look and said, "My father smiled at breakfast. He does not usually smile at breakfast." "Perhaps he was in a good mood," Harriet said. "He was looking at you when he smiled," Tommy said. "I just thought you should know." "Thank you, Tommy," Harriet said. Tommy nodded. "I think it is a good thing," he said, "in case you were wondering." And then he went outside to see about the chickens, and Harriet stood in the kitchen and felt something warm and complicated move through her that had everything to do with the fact that this boy, in his quiet, thoughtful way, had just given her something she had not known she needed, which was permission. Christmas came to the Double H with more ceremony than it had seen in 2 years. Harriet made a proper Christmas dinner, and Agnes Beaumont came out from town, and Pico Reyes ate with them at the main table, and Tommy had a wooden horse that Bernard had carved, and a new pair of boots from the general store, and there was sugar candy and a fruitcake that Harriet had been working on since early December, and the house was warm and full of the particular quality of a place that is being lived in completely. In the evening, after Tommy was in bed and Agnes had gone back to town in her buggy, Harriet and Bernard sat by the fire, and he took her hand without preamble, with the simple directness that was characteristic of him, and they sat like that for a long time without needing to say anything, and outside the desert winter was cold and enormous, and inside the fire was warm, and Harriet thought about what her life had been a year ago. Alone in a Santa Fe boarding house with David Copperfield and the sound of other people's households, and she thought about what it was now, and she was grateful in a way that went all the way down. January and February went hard with the ranch work, the coldest stretch of a high desert winter, and there was an ice storm in late January that kept everyone indoors for 3 days and required Harriet and Bernard and Pico all working together to make sure the cattle had enough shelter and feed. The ice storm was miserable and exhausting, and also, in the particular way of genuine hardship shared by people who trust each other, very revealing. Harriet discovered that Bernard in difficult circumstances was the same Bernard in ordinary circumstances, steady and clear-headed and darkly funny about misfortune in a way that made hard things bearable. And she felt, in those 3 days of frozen pipes and frustrated cattle and improvised problem-solving, more certain than she had felt about any other decision she had ever made. On the 3rd day, when the worst was over and the cattle were settled and the pipes had been thawed and they were back in the kitchen with coffee, and the particular exhausted satisfaction of having handled something difficult together, Bernard said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she saw in that moment that he was, under all the steadiness, genuinely nervous, which she found both surprising and deeply endearing. "I want you to marry me," he said, "not as a practical arrangement, not because it makes sense for the ranch or for Tommy or for any other reason except that I want you to be here and I want to be with you, and I do not want to spend any more time not saying so." He paused. "That is not a very elegant proposal." "I don't need elegant," she said. "I need true." "It is completely true," he said. She looked at him, this man who had seen her walk in from a broken wagon wheel and given her work and treated her with consistent respect and fallen in love with her without making it her problem to manage, who had chosen her first and said so plainly and had spent 2 months proving that he meant it. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He exhaled, and she realized he had been genuinely unsure, which meant he had asked her not out of confidence but out of genuine desire and genuine risk, and that meant more to her than 100 certain proposals would have. He took her face in his hands and kissed her, and she leaned into it, and outside the ice was melting in the desert sun, and the cattle were settling, and the territory was exactly as beautiful and hard and generous as it had ever been. They were married in April, when the desert was briefly and extravagantly green, and the apple tree in the kitchen garden was blossoming, in the adobe church in Dry Creek on a Saturday morning with Agnes Beaumont as Harriet's witness and Pico Reyes standing for Bernard, and Tommy as the most serious 8-year-old ring-bearer in the history of New Mexico territory, performing his duties with the precision of someone who has been practicing. The Reverend, a gentle man named Eustace Holt, who had been conducting services in Dry Creek for 12 years, and had seen enough of human experience to recognize the difference between a marriage made out of convenience and a marriage made out of something real, looked at Bernard and Harriet with genuine warmth, and said, later, to Agnes, that he had not seen 2 people come to the altar with that kind of settled certainty in longer than he could remember. Harriet wore the best dress she owned, which was a deep blue-gray wool that she had pressed until it was perfect, and she had flowers in her hair because Tommy had insisted on it and had gone out early in the morning to pick them himself, small yellow wildflowers from the creek bed, and she wore them with the same simple happiness with which she was wearing everything about that morning. Bernard looked at her when she came through the church door, in the way he had of looking at her that she had never entirely gotten used to and did not want to get used to, with complete, undivided, genuine presence, and he said very quietly just for her, "You are extraordinary," and she said, "You are biased," and he said, "Completely," and they were both smiling when they made their vows. Agnes threw rice and made everyone eat her pie afterward in the churchyard in the spring sunshine, and Sheriff Tate shook Bernard's hand and tipped his hat to Harriet, and several of the townswomen who had been watching this particular development with interest offered their congratulations with varying degrees of enthusiasm and sincerity, and Vera Garrison, who had come because small towns in New Mexico territory in 1879 operated on the principle that you showed up to these things regardless of your feelings about them, shook Harriet's hand with a graciousness that Harriet genuinely respected, because it cost something and Vera paid it anyway. The ride back to the Double H that afternoon was the same red clay road Harriet had first traveled in the other direction nearly a year ago, and the desert was in its spring splendor. And Tommy was sitting between them in the wagon talking about whether the chickens would notice that anything had changed. And Bernard had his arm around Harriet's shoulders in the easy, companionable way of someone who has stopped being careful about showing what matters to him. And Harriet felt the sun on her face and thought that this was what it felt like to be someone's first choice, not just in words but in the thousand small daily ways that constitute a life. And it was, she thought, exactly as good as she had suspected it would be. Spring became summer, and summer was full and busy and good. Harriet kept the house and the garden and helped with the accounts, which she turned out to have a genuine talent for, organizing them with a clarity that Bernard acknowledged with characteristic directness was considerably better than what he had been doing before. They spent the evenings together as they had before their marriage, by the fire or on the porch, talking and reading and existing in the comfortable shared space of two people who genuinely enjoy each other's company, except that now there was no careful distance maintained. Now she could lean against his shoulder when she was tired and he would rest his chin on her hair. And it was such a simple thing, but it was the simplest things she was learning that carried the most weight. Tommy, who had processed the marriage with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything, came to Harriet one evening in June and asked her, with the gravity of someone raising a matter of some importance, whether he was supposed to call her something different now. "You can call me whatever feels right to you," she said. "Miss Harper, Harriet, whatever you like." He thought about this for a long moment. "I think I would like to call you Mama," he said, "if that would be all right, not to replace my first Mama. Just because you are here and you are mine, and I think that is what the word is for." Harriet looked at this boy who had been so careful with his trust and so generous with it once it was given, and she said, "That would be more than all right, Tommy. That would make me very happy." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his book, and Harriet sat in the kitchen and cried very quietly for a few minutes, which was entirely about happiness and nothing else. She told Bernard about it that evening, and he held her hand and did not say very much, because he was a man who understood that some moments did not need commentary, only witnessing. In August, Harriet told Bernard she was with child. She told him in the kitchen, early in the morning, before the light was fully up, with the particular straightforwardness she brought to everything, and he stared at her for a moment with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something very open and unguarded, and then he crossed the kitchen in the same 3 purposeful steps he had taken on the December evening when he had taken her hands. And he held her with a completeness and a tenderness that made her close her eyes and lean entirely into him. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first thing he asked, and she loved him acutely for that being the first thing. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said, into her hair. "Then I am going to be a complete nuisance about this." "I suspected as much," she said. He was. He was attentive and occasionally hovering in a way that she had to gently redirect several times a day, and he made sure she had everything she needed and consulted Dr. Emmons in Dry Creek with a thoroughness that made Dr. Emmons, a practical man of 50, tell him with some affection that first-time fathers were the same in every generation, and Bernard said Tommy was his first, and Dr. Emmons said, grinning, that it appeared not to have cured him of the condition. Tommy was excited in a serious, deliberate way, asking questions about babies with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting research, and gradually organizing his thoughts about the subject into a settled acceptance that included specific opinions about names, most of which were names from his reading books, and some of which were genuinely impossible. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was a full and rich time at the Double H. The cattle herd had grown, and the ranch was turning a proper profit for the first time since Bernard had started it 5 years ago, and there was talk of expanding the grazing land by purchasing an adjacent parcel from a man who had decided New Mexico territory was not where he wanted to spend his remaining years. The ranch's accounts, which Harriet was now managing with complete authority, showed clearly that this was a sound investment, and she and Bernard sat together at the kitchen table on several November evenings with the account spread between them, and talked it through with the companionable intensity of two people working on something they both care about. And when they decided to go ahead with the purchase, they shook hands over the table and then both laughed at the formality of it. The land purchase went through in December, and Pico Reyes, who had been steady and excellent for over a year, was given more responsibility and a raise in wages, and Bernard hired a second ranch hand, a quiet man named George Strand who came with a good recommendation from a ranch in Colorado and proved, over the following months, to be exactly as competent as advertised. The child was born in the first week of March 1880, on a night when the desert was cold and clear, and the stars were very numerous, and Dr. Emmons drove out from Dry Creek, and Agnes Beaumont came with him, because Agnes had attended more births in the territory than Dr. Emmons, and he knew it. It was a boy, a fine healthy boy with his father's dark hair, and Agnes said with great authority, his mother's eyes, and Bernard held him in the kitchen while Harriet rested, with an expression of the kind of pure, uncomplicated wonder that the hardest-working, most practical men sometimes produce when faced with something their practicality cannot quite account for. They named him James William Whitfield, James for Bernard's father and William, because Harriet had always liked the name, and Bernard had agreed with the straightforwardness of a man who is very happy about everything and would have agreed to almost anything in that moment. Tommy came in and looked at James with the expression of someone revising their understanding of the world in light of new information, and then said carefully, "He is very small." "He will get bigger," Bernard said. "Yes," Tommy said. "I know." He looked at the baby for another long moment. "He has Mama's eyes." Harriet, from the bed, heard this and felt the word Mama in Tommy's mouth as he applied it to her, and felt the easy naturalness of it, and thought that some things that you have spent a long time being afraid to want have a way of arriving with a quietness that makes you realize the fear was never equal to the actual thing. Spring returned to the Double H Ranch with the desert in its brief wild bloom, and Harriet was in the kitchen garden with James in a basket near her feet and Tommy reading on the porch steps, and the sound of Bernard in the stable with the horses, and the territory spread out around the ranch in every direction under a sky that was the particular deep blue of the high desert, and she straightened up and looked at it all. She thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago, walking 4 miles along a canyon road with a broken suitcase and a handful of dollars, and the deeply private certainty that this was simply what her life was, useful and reliable and never quite first. She thought about 26 years of being the capable one, the steady one, the one who managed and maintained and was thanked and overlooked. She thought about standing in a kitchen on a December evening and telling a man the plain truth about what her life had been, and the way he had looked at her when she said it, not with pity, not with reassurance of the empty kind, but with the full weight of someone who has heard exactly what was said and is choosing, clearly and deliberately, to answer it directly. "I am choosing you first, Harriet, not after anyone else, not as the sensible choice, first." And she thought about what it had been like to believe him, and what it had cost her to believe him, and what the world had become since she had. Bernard came out of the stable and crossed the yard toward her, and he slowed down as he always did when he was near her, not hurrying past but arriving, and he looked at James in the basket and smiled, and then he looked at Harriet with the same expression she had been watching on his face for over a year now, steady and warm and completely present, and he said, "Garden looks good." "It does," she said. "You look better," he said, with the simplicity of a man who says what he means. "You are still biased," she said. "Completely," he said. And he came and stood beside her in the kitchen garden in the spring sunlight, and she leaned her shoulder against his. And they looked at their son in his basket, and their ranch in its growing, and the desert in its extravagant bloom. And the world was exactly as large as it had always been, and she was exactly the right size for it. The years that followed were good ones, in the way that only years of genuine partnership and honest daily work and steady love can be good, not without their difficulties. Because the territory and the ranch and the raising of children were all things that came with their full complement of hardship, but good in the way that matters, which is to say that the difficulties were faced together and the pleasures were shared, and neither was diminished by the other. Tommy grew into an adolescent of 14 who was serious and thoughtful, and had inherited both his father's steadiness and his mother's precise way with words, and who had decided that he wanted to study law when he was old enough, a decision that Harriet supported with complete conviction and Bernard supported with the slightly surprised pride of a man who had not expected that particular path, but was genuinely glad of it. James grew from a baby into a vigorous small boy of 3 who had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, and a gift for finding mud that was remarkable in its thoroughness and consistency. The Double H continued to grow. Bernard's cattle operation became one of the more respected in the county, and the expanded grazing land proved its worth, and the accounts, which Harriet kept with her characteristic precision, told a clear and satisfying story of a ranch that was genuinely prospering. Bernard hired 2 more hands, expanded the stable, and began talking about a new structure for winter hay storage that Harriet had been recommending for 2 seasons. In the late spring of 1882, Harriet discovered she was expecting again, and told Bernard in the kitchen in the morning in the same direct way she had told him the first time, and he reacted with the same open wonder he had the first time, which she had not expected but was very glad of, because it meant that nothing about this had become routine to him. The second child arrived in November of 1882, a girl this time, with Harriet's auburn hair and Bernard's steady eyes, a combination that Agnes Beaumont, who was present again by her own insistence, declared to be entirely unfair in its effect on everyone who looked at her. They named her Clara Ellen Whitfield, Clara because it was a name Harriet had always loved and Ellen for Bernard's first wife. And when Bernard held his daughter for the first time and looked at Harriet over the baby's head, there were no words for what was in his face, but it was something complete and something grateful and something that recognized the fullness of the life that had been made. Tommy, who was 15 by then, and had been present for the naming discussion with all the gravity of a young man taking his responsibilities seriously, approved of the name Ellen, and said so quietly and privately to his father, which was his way of saying something that mattered. James, who was 3, held his sister with the intense concentration of someone who has been given something valuable to look after and intends to take the assignment seriously, and said, "Her hair is red like Mama's," and then looked up with bright brown eyes and said, "I like it." The winter of 1882 going into 1883 was a full house and a full life and a full happiness, the good kind of full that is made of ordinary things done consistently, and with love, meals and bedtimes, and the accounts at the kitchen table, and the evening conversations on the porch when the children were asleep, and the desert was quiet and large and lit with stars. On a particular evening in February of 1883, with a fire going in the main room and the sound of James asleep in his room, and Clara in her cradle and Tommy reading in the corner with the focused expression that had not changed since he was 6 years old, Harriet was sitting beside Bernard on the sofa that had replaced the kitchen table as their evening center of gravity, and she was thinking about something she wanted to say. She had been thinking about it for several days, not because it was difficult to say, but because she wanted to say it exactly right, which was, Bernard would have told her, entirely characteristic of her. "Bernard," she said. He said, not looking up from the account book he was reviewing, "I want to tell you something." He put down the account book immediately and looked at her with full attention, because he always did, because in 4 years he had never once treated something she wanted to tell him as less important than whatever else he was doing. "I spent a very long time," she said, "believing that I was the kind of person that things happened around but not quite to. That I was the steady ground that other people moved across, but that I myself did not move. I built a very complete life out of being capable and useful, and I told myself it was enough, and most of the time I almost believed it." He was listening the way he always listened, with his complete self. "I want to tell you," she said, "that you have made me understand what it is like to be the thing, and not just the ground the thing happens on. And I did not know it was possible to feel this fully inside a life, and I am very glad you chose first, and I am very glad I believed you." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, in the quiet, direct voice that was the voice of his truest self, "I am going to spend the rest of my life being grateful that you walked 4 miles on a broken road with a suitcase held together by a strap." She laughed and he smiled, the complete version that she loved best, and he put his arm around her and she rested her head on his shoulder, and the fire was warm and the house was full, and outside the New Mexico Territory winter was cold and clear and brilliant. And this was her life, completely and truly her own, built from honest work and honest love and the single brave moment of believing a man who had looked her in the eye and told her she was first. Agnes Beaumont came to visit the following Saturday, as she often did, with her frank assessments and excellent pie, and she sat at the Whitfield kitchen table and drank Harriet's coffee and said, as she sometimes did when the mood took her, something that was simultaneously obvious and worth saying. "You know," she said, watching Harriet at the counter and Bernard in the doorway asking Harriet something about the spring planting, and the way they looked at each other when she answered, "I have been watching people be married in this territory since before most of them were born, and I want it on record that you two are one of the very few who do it right." "How is that?" Bernard asked. "You pay attention," Agnes said. "Most people stop after a while. You two still pay attention." Bernard looked at Harriet and Harriet looked at him, and they did not say anything to Agnes about it because some things are better kept between the two people they belong to, but they both knew what the other was thinking, which was that paying attention was the whole of it, the whole secret and the whole practice, and that they intended to continue doing it for as long as they had. The spring came again, as it always did, with the desert in its brief wild miracle, flowers coming up through the red clay in impossible colors, and the air coming off the mountains with the smell of snow melt and sage, and the particular freshness of a world that has survived another winter and is very pleased about it. Harriet Harper Whitfield stood in her kitchen garden in the morning light, 30 years old and entirely at home in her life, with Clara on her hip and James at her feet, attempting to explain something complex about a beetle he had found, and Tommy's voice from inside the house asking where his schoolbook had got to, and Bernard crossing the yard toward her with the particular unhurried purposefulness that she had loved from the very first morning. He stopped next to her and looked at the garden and the mountains and then at her, and she looked back at him with the full and unguarded directness of a woman who has stopped keeping anything in reserve, who has learned that being fully seen is not the danger she thought it was but the thing itself, the actual center of what a life is for. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. And the desert was bright and enormous around them, and the house was full behind them, and ahead of them was every day of the rest of their lives, built on honest work and chosen love and the simple, brave decision to believe someone who tells you that you are worth choosing first, and then to go on proving it, morning by morning, in every small and ordinary and extraordinary way that two people who belong to each other have always found to make it true. Dry Creek, New Mexico Territory, grew over the following years, the silver mines drawing enough population to push the settlement past the uncertain stage into something that called itself a proper town with some conviction. A new school was built, a real one this time, separate from the church, and Tommy Whitfield was one of its first and most dedicated students before eventually heading east to study law in 1887. At 17 years old, with a trunk full of books and the steady, serious confidence of a young man who has been raised to know exactly what he is worth. He said goodbye to his family on a September morning with the practiced composure of someone who has decided he is not going to cry and is concentrating very hard on that decision. And then he hugged Harriet, who had been his mama in every way that mattered for 8 years, and he said quietly, "You are the best of us." And she held him tightly and said, "Write every week," and he did. James grew into a boy of 7, who was his father's right-hand deputy on the ranch, following Bernard everywhere with the intense devotion of someone who has decided that whatever the man he admires most is doing is probably the most important thing happening in the world at that moment, and who had also, somewhere in his 7th year, decided that horses were the finest beings on earth and was conducting a thorough investigation of this thesis on a daily basis. Clara, at 4, was a force of nature in small and auburn-haired form, who held opinions on every subject and expressed them clearly and often, and who had wrapped herself around every person at the Double H and several in Dry Creek with the complete confidence of someone who has never had reason to doubt that she is wanted. On a September evening in 1887, the same week Tommy left for his studies, Harriet and Bernard sat on the porch in the cooling evening, and Bernard said, with the reflective quality that came on him sometimes in the autumn, "Do you remember what you said to me in the kitchen that first December?" She knew exactly what he meant. "I remember," she said. "I have thought about it many times," he said. "What it cost you to say that." "It needed saying," she said. "It did," he said. "And I want you to know that every time I think about it, I think about how much courage it took and how glad I am that you had it." She looked at him in the evening light, this man who had spent 8 years proving, in every consistent and ordinary and deliberate way, that he had meant exactly what he said on that December evening, who had never once made her doubt that she was first, not by grand gestures, but by the steady accumulated weight of all the small attentions and choices that constitute a marriage lived right. "I had to have it," she said. "I had been careful for a very long time. It was time to be brave instead." "You have always been brave," he said. "You just did not always know it." She thought about that, and she thought he was probably right, and she was glad she had finally figured it out. The letter Tommy sent from his first week of school was 4 pages long and contained detailed observations about the city and the law faculty and the other students, and a postscript that said, "I think of the ranch every day and Mama's corn bread every Sunday. Tell James not to let the horses walk all over him. Kiss Clara for me. I am well and I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Harriet read it aloud at the supper table and then folded it carefully and put it with the others she would keep, because some things are worth keeping with care, and love expressed clearly and honestly, whether from a son to his mother or from a husband to his wife, is one of the things worth keeping most. The Double H Ranch stood in its acres under the New Mexico sky, solid and growing, tended by people who had built it with their hands and their care, and their willingness to do the hard work of showing up every single day. And inside it, the life that Harriet Harper had walked 4 miles on a broken road to find was everything she had been worth waiting for, and she had been worth waiting for a very long time. She had never once been anyone's first choice. She had told him that December evening, with all the quiet courage of a woman who has decided to speak the truth of her own experience regardless of what it costs. He had looked her in the eye and said he was choosing first, and he meant every word of it. And he had spent every day since proving it, in the way that matters most, which is not in words but in the full and present and consistent reality of a life genuinely shared. And Harriet Whitfield, standing in her kitchen garden in any given spring morning with the desert around her, and the house full behind her and the man she loved crossing the yard toward her, knew that she had been right to believe him, and knew that she would go on believing him, and knew that this This ordinary, extraordinary, chosen daily life was what being first had always looked like, and it was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough.